Jon Favreau has been hiding things in Star Wars since the first episode of The Mandalorian in 2019, when the community spent weeks cataloging every production detail, every background prop, and every piece of Aurebesh text in every frame of every scene. The Mandalorian and Grogu is the theatrical version of that same impulse, a film made by someone who loves Star Wars enough to reward the people who have been paying attention for 48 years, and who trust that audience to find things without being told to look. Here is every Easter egg, the ones you caught and the ones that were hidden specifically for the people who have read every piece of graffiti in every background of every episode. Let's break this down. The Weathers Apollo sign, the Carl Weathers tribute. They hid a dead man's name in the background in Aurebesh, in a language most people do not know exists, and let the community find it. The trailer that dropped on February 17, 2026, was the first theatrical trailer for the first Star Wars film in nearly 7 years. The community was ready. Within hours, someone had translated the Aurebesh text on a shop sign in the background of the street sequence, visible for approximately 1 second, in a language that requires deliberate effort to read, and found it said, Weathers Apollo. Carl Weathers, who played Greef Karga in all 3 seasons of The Mandalorian, died in February 2024. The sign was Favreau's tribute, not a text card in the credits, not a dedication at the opening of the film, but a piece of Aurebesh graffiti on a shop front in a Star Wars city that only the people who were paying close enough attention would ever find. Weathers Apollo referenced both Greef Karga and Weathers' most famous prior role, Apollo Creed in the Rocky franchise, the character that had made him one of the most recognizable actors of his generation before a generation of Mandalorian viewers came to know him primarily as the man who ran Navarro's Bounty Hunter Guild. The Aurebesh placement was Favreau, understanding his audience, the Star Wars community that reads background text in alien alphabets as a matter of course, and putting the tribute where that audience would find it. He honored Carl Weathers in the specific language of the people who had loved Greef Karga. The 3 AT-ATs and the opening battle. Din Djarin destroys 3 AT-AT walkers in the film's opening action sequence single-handedly in a snowy mountain environment whose visual language is the most direct reference to The Empire Strikes Back that the film deploys at the level of iconography. The AT-AT, the all-terrain armored transport, the Imperial Walker whose legs were cut by Luke Skywalker's cable during the Battle of Hoth, is among the most recognizable designs in the franchise's visual vocabulary. And the film's opening sequence was Favreau, using that vocabulary to establish the film's cinematic scale immediately. Luke destroyed 1 AT-AT with a cable and a thermal detonator at the Battle of Hoth, which was the original trilogy's most celebrated single combat achievement against the vehicles. Din destroys 3 in solo combat, which was the film's first statement about where Din Djarin sits in the galaxy's power landscape in 2026. The snowy environment, the walker silhouettes against a white sky, the scale of the machines relative to the single armored figure fighting them, all of it was the film opening with the most classically Star Wars visual possible as the confirmation that this was a theatrical Star Wars film rather than an extended television episode. The INT-4 Interceptor that Commander Barrow attempts his escape in, a vehicle based on classic Kenner toy designs, was the battle sequence's deepest cut prop reference, a vehicle whose existence in Star Wars lore traces back to toys rather than to screen appearances. Zeb Orrelios, the first Rebels character in a theatrical Star Wars film. Zeb Orrelios, the Lasat warrior who had been one of the core crew of the Ghost in Star Wars Rebels, appeared in The Mandalorian Season 3's finale as a brief cameo, his live-action introduction into the franchise's theatrical history reserved for what had been a streaming series. His role in The Mandalorian and Grogu expanded that cameo into a full supporting presence, and his presence in a theatrical Star Wars film was the most historically significant single casting decision in the film for anyone who had been tracking the franchise's animated legacy. Dave Filoni spent over 20 years building Star Wars animation, The Clone Wars from 2008 to 2020, Rebels from 2014 to 2018, The Bad Batch, and the Ahsoka series. Zeb was a Rebels character. His theatrical appearance was Filoni's animated work being fully integrated into the cinematic Star Wars canon at the level that the original trilogy characters had always occupied. Zeb piloting a Rebel U-Wing, a ship introduced in Rogue One that had been used during the Clone Wars era, whose appearance communicated that the New Republic was deploying every available asset in its operational inventory, was the film using a Rebels character in a Rogue One-era vehicle, which was the most compressed possible demonstration of how completely the Filoni-era's expanded universe had become part of the franchise's mainstream continuity. His comment about mechanics, a reference to a deep-cut Star Wars profession from the expanded universe, people who perform spacewalk repairs on ship hulls, was the film's deepest-cut single dialogue Easter egg, a term that had existed in Star Wars lore since the original expanded universe and that the film deployed as Zeb's character detail. Rotta's hologram, the Clone Wars callback. When the Hutt twins task Din Djarin with finding their kidnapped nephew, they show him a holographic image of young Rotta, and the hologram looks exactly like the version of Rotta that appeared in the 2008 Star Wars, The Clone Wars animated film. The 2008 film introduced Rotta as Jabba the Hutt's infant son, a small and squirming Hutt baby that Ahsoka Tano nicknamed Stinky during the mission to rescue him and return him to Jabba. The hologram that the Hutt twins show Din replicates that infant appearance, the same round head, the same early Hutt features, in live action, which was the film's most affectionate single nod to the animated continuity that had introduced the character 18 years earlier. The contrast between the hologram's infant version and the adult Rotta, who Din eventually encounters in the fighting ring on Shikari, was the film's most efficient single visual joke about the passage of time. The twins showing Din the baby photo, so he knows who he is looking for, and Din's subsequent discovery that the baby photo subject was now a physically imposing gladiator who was giving as good as he got in an underground fighting ring. Jeremy Allen White's vocal performance gave the adult Rotta a quality that honored the Clone Wars version without being limited by it. A character who carried the history of the 2008 film's Stinky, while being fully realized as an independent adult entity with his own capabilities and his own relationship to the criminal world his family ran. The Dejarik creatures come to life. The holochess game that C-3PO and Chewbacca play aboard the Millennium Falcon in A New Hope used 8 creature pieces, the Mantelian Savrip, the Kintan Strider, the Kalorslug, and 5 others, as the animated game's visual language. Holographic projections of creatures that existed somewhere in the Star Wars galaxy. The community had cataloged the Dejarik creatures in loving detail across decades of Star Wars reference material. The Mandalorian and Grogu rendered them as real, living animals, actually existing creatures that Din Djarin had to fight in an arena sequence whose specific joke was that he gradually realized the arena match was being run like a Dejarik game, with the creatures positioned and deployed according to Dejarik rules rather than as a conventional gladiatorial fight. The Mantelian Savrip, one of the most recognizable Dejarik pieces from A New Hope, the large creature whose silhouette had been part of the franchise's visual vocabulary since 1910, was the film's most spectacular single creature realization, a living version of the thing that had been a game piece on the Millennium Falcon 48 years earlier. Favreau had taken objects that sat on a holographic chessboard in the original film and made them creatures that his characters had to fight, which was the Easter egg operating at the level that rewards the specific kind of attention that only 4 decades of continuous Star Wars engagement produces. The trapdoor and the dragon snake, Jabba's playbook. The Hutt twins dropped Din Djarin through a trapdoor into a monster pit beneath their throne room. The specific staging of the threat as entertainment rather than as combat, the Hutt entertainment instinct converting a disposal mechanism into a performance. The callback was direct and deliberate. Return of the Jedi had staged Jabba the Hutt dropping Luke Skywalker through a trapdoor into the Rancor pit, and the Clone Wars had placed Obi-Wan Kenobi against a dragon snake on Rhodia in a sequence whose specific visual language the film was invoking. The dragon snake that Din had to fight beneath the Hutt twins' throne was the film's third layer of the same reference, the monster pit as Hutt punishment tradition, the dragon snake as Clone Wars callback, and the specific visual of a single armored warrior fighting a creature, while a Hutt audience watched as the franchise's most specific recurring entertainment tradition. The Anuba that Embo deployed, named Kibu, explicitly not the same Anuba, named Marok, who had appeared alongside Embo in the Clone Wars animated series, was a detail the film addressed directly enough that the community registered it as an acknowledgement that these were different animals in the same tradition rather than a continuity oversight. Embo returns, the Clone Wars fan-favorite bounty hunter, the Kyuzo bounty hunter who had been one of the Clone Wars' most beloved recurring antagonists, distinctive for his broad-rimmed hat that functioned as a weapon, his athletic combat style, and his deeply competent professional menace, returned in The Mandalorian and Grogu as the bounty hunter who successfully captured Din Djarin on Shakari. Embo had last appeared in the Clone Wars in significant capacity during the 5th season, and his return in the film's live-action context was handled with the specific care that Favreau applied to every Clone Wars reference. His hat was present, his combat style was consistent with the animated version, and his new Anuba Kebu was deployed with the same coordination that the animated Embo had demonstrated with Merrick. His capture of Din, the moment where the film's most capable protagonist was successfully apprehended by a bounty hunter operating professionally, was the franchise's acknowledgement that Embo had always been exactly as dangerous as the Clone Wars had portrayed him. His function in the film as the Hutt-employed bounty hunter who brought Din in was the kind of deployment that made the 15 years since his Clone Wars appearances feel continuous rather than archived. The Anzalans and the Minch name. The 4 Anzalans who appeared in the film were the same group that had been introduced in The Mandalorian Season 3 on Navarro. Tiny, goggles-wearing technicians whose most famous representative was Babu Frik from The Rise of Skywalker. All 4 were voiced by Shirley Henderson, who had previously voiced Babu Frik and who was known to a generation of film audiences as Moaning Myrtle from the Harry Potter films. Their names, Bai, Kling, Kito, and Minch, were the film's most specific hidden Easter egg in character naming. The name Minch was Yoda's original name in the early drafts of The Empire Strikes Back. The character had been called Minch Yoda before the name was shortened to simply Yoda. An Anzellan named Minch in a film that featured Grogu, the character whose species and connection to Yoda had been the franchise's most sustained running mystery since 2019, was Favreau naming a character after Yoda's original draft name in a film where the person most associated with Yoda's legacy was one of the 2 protagonists. The connection was not incidental. J.J. Abrams, who created the Anzellans and Babu Frik for The Rise of Skywalker, received a special thanks in the film's credits, which was the franchise acknowledging that the Anzellans' substantial role in The Mandalorian and Grogu owed a debt to the character design he had introduced. I can bring you in warm or cold. The catchphrase returns. Din Djarin's most recognizable line of dialogue landed in the film for the 3rd time in the franchise's history, delivered to Lord Janu in the specific professional register that the catchphrase had always carried, the bounty hunter's most efficient communication of the terms of a capture. The line had debuted in Chapter 1 of The Mandalorian in 2019, directed at the Mythrol in the bar sequence that established Din's professional character before the season's plot had begun. It returned in Chapter 5 of the Book of Boba Fett, directed at criminal Kaba Baiz. Its 3rd appearance in The Mandalorian and Grogu was the franchise treating the line as Din Djarin's specific professional identity marker, the thing he said to targets in the same way that certain recurring phrases became the verbal signature of franchise characters whose consistency the audience had come to identify with their fundamental nature. The specific casualness with which the film deployed the line, treating it as natural dialogue rather than as a self-aware callback, was the franchise's confidence that the community would catch it without the film needing to signal that something was being referenced. Grogu's front flip, Luke Skywalker's training. Grogu executes a distinctive acrobatic front flip repeatedly during the film's action sequences, a specific movement that reviewers and community members identified not as something Grogu had developed independently, but as something that had been taught to him. The training sequence in the Book of Boba Fett, in which Luke Skywalker worked with Grogu on his physical capabilities alongside his Force development, had included specific acrobatic training whose results were not immediately visible in the television series' subsequent action sequences. The film was the first context in which Grogu's combat mobility had been given enough screen time in sustained action sequences to show what the training had produced. And the front flip was the specific detail that communicated continuity with what Luke had taught him. He was not simply a more capable fighter. He was a fighter whose specific movement vocabulary traced back to specific training from a specific teacher, which was the franchise's most subtle acknowledgement that the Skywalker connection to Grogu's development had persisted in his body even after his choice to leave the training and return to Din at the end of the Book of Boba Fett. The Death Watch cloth, Din's armor cleaning scene. In a quiet character scene that many viewers passed over in their attention to the film's action sequences, Din Djarin is shown cleaning his Beskar armor, the specific maintenance ritual of a Mandalorian warrior caring for the material expression of his identity. The cloth he uses bears the faded emblem of Death Watch, the radical Mandalorian splinter group whose members had rescued him as an orphaned child during the Clone Wars, and whose creed had formed the foundation of everything he was. The Death Watch emblem on the cleaning cloth was the film's most layered single-prop detail, a Mandalorian warrior whose entire adult identity had been shaped by the Children of the Watch, the covert descended from Death Watch, cleaning the armor that represented his current identity with a cloth bearing the emblem of the organization that had made him. He had questioned the creed across 3 seasons of the television series, had been expelled from it, had sought redemption through the waters of Mandalore, and had returned to it having understood it differently than he had before. The Death Watch cloth was his relationship to that history made physical, the past he had been formed by, maintained in his hand as the tool he used to care for the armor that carried him into the future he was building for himself and for Grogu. The credits, every name that carries a story. The special thanks section of The Mandalorian and Grogu's credits contained a collection of names that each represented a specific piece of the franchise's history. J.J. Abrams, director of The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, creator of Babu Frick and the Anzellans, was thanked in a film where the Anzellans played a substantial role, which was the franchise acknowledging that the characters who had felt like comic relief in The Rise of Skywalker had become central to the emotional core of the franchise's next theatrical chapter. Guillermo del Toro was thanked specifically because he helped design and conceptualize the Hutts in the film. Del Toro had for years been attached to a Jabba the Hutt-centered Star Wars project that never materialized, and his design influence on the Hutt twins was the film incorporating that dormant creative investment into the project where the Hutts were finally given the cinematic treatment his interest had always pointed toward. Taika Waititi, who had directed Chapter 8, Redemption of the Mandalorian, voiced both IG-11 and IG-12 in the series, and was simultaneously developing his own untitled Star Wars film, was thanked in the credits of the franchise's theatrical return, the network of Star Wars creative relationships made visible in the list of names behind the film. Anthony Daniels, C-3PO himself, the actor who had been in every Star Wars theatrical film since 1977, voiced an air traffic controller in The Mandalorian and Grogu, continuing a streak of presence in the franchise's theatrical output while playing a character for whom the name Anthony Daniels was not listed prominently. He was there. He was always there. The franchise that started with his voice was 48 years old, and he was still in it, playing someone new, in a film that contained every layer of the history that had produced it.